All right. Well, we had some technical difficulties getting this webinar to come up online tonight, so I apologize if you were trying to get us on YouTube and didn't see it initially. It just didn't go live for some reason. So I do apologize for that and apologize for the confusion. Hopefully you are either catching this live or you're going to get the recording that I'm going to email out to you after this presentation's over. So thanks again for signing up. And the purpose of the webinar tonight is really to talk about what can happen and how we can still protect assets even when someone is already in a nursing home or when they are rapidly heading that way. So let's dive right in to the slide. So from panic to plan is what we've called this. And, it really is, it can be really a situation of panic when you have a loved one who needs care now or is already in care and you're watching the money go away. And so this is the kind of stuff we deal with every day and can hopefully help you navigate. So just a little, we're in the process of a little bit of a branding change right now. So you might see our logo in one of these two forms. So I just wanted to put them both on there. We're going from the one to the left to the one on the right. So this is me. I was a police officer for 20 years, retired as a chief of police, and I did law school the easy way. I went part-time while I was a police officer. So I've actually been an attorney since 2009. This is what I do. So when I retired, I decided I wanted to focus my law practice on elder law and estate planning. For various reasons, I felt like it really allowed me to continue to serve people. And also because I was really close with my grandparents, particularly my grandmothers as a kid. And so I always had an affinity really for working with seniors. And so with this career, I like our slogan or our tagline and really our mission is that we help seniors and their families or seniors and their loved ones worry less about the legal care and financial challenges of aging. And the how is we do that through some estate planning, elder law, elder care law, which is really combining legal planning with care coordination. We also handle probate and guardianships. So the one thing that I always like to remind people is to put your own mask on first, right? It's the airline safety message. And by joining this webinar, you are doing that for yourself. You are taking the time to really get some help and guidance through the process. And so that is part of putting your own mask on first. Part of putting your own mask on first really is also doing the things that you love and making sure you make time for yourself, because it's really hard to take care of others if you're not able to take care of yourself in the process as well. So let's dive right in. And some of the common triggers, so the things that would happen that get to the point where we have sort of what we in the industry call a Medicaid crisis. Many of our clients come to us because of a sudden hospitalization, and they're trying to really on the fly come up with discharge plans. The hospital is saying, mom or dad is getting released, and what's the plan? Where are they going to go? How are you going to pay for that care? And a lot of times families haven't planned for this. It's not, if you haven't, you're not alone. Again, it's a very common scenario, and it can be very stressful because, when your loved one's in the hospital, things can be kind of touch and go, and it can seem like things are going in one direction, and then all of a sudden there's a rapid improvement. And with the way that insurance works, the idea is that they have to move out of that hospital quickly and maybe to rehab or maybe to a long-term care facility. That creates a lot of stress. It can also just be that there's a rapid decline for someone who's living at home, and somewhat suddenly they really just aren't safe to live at home on their own anymore, and you have to deal immediately with that crisis of what do we do next? We've seen this happen. I saw this happen as a police officer, sometimes with memory care type issues, Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that, where things seem to be going okay, and then all of a sudden someone has an incident where they wander or get lost or things like that, and the whole situation rapidly changes pretty quickly. I have on here, a loved one who's already been admitted without a plan. We've helped in these scenarios as well. In fact, we just started working with a client about a month ago whose loved one went into the nursing home in January, privately paying with what little money this family had saved up. And that money was disappearing very rapidly. And now we're able to put in in place a plan that is going to protect a lot of their assets, and assets that they didn't even realize that they could protect. And then also there's this fear and confusion around spending down. Sometimes people have heard the term spend down when it comes to Medicaid or long-term care, and they just really don't know what that means. They think it means they need to spend everything, but they're just not sure. And I'll throw one more thing in here, which is just people get confused about giving things away. People often hear about the IRS's gift tax exemption. They think, oh, I can give like $18,000 or $20,000 away with no problems. And that is true for the IRS, but that is not true with Medicaid. That just giving away assets can cause problems. So if you already have a loved one in the nursing home, you know this already, but the average cost that we're seeing in Northern Kentucky is somewhere around $11,000 a month for nursing home care. And there's a common misconception that Medicare will pay for nursing home coverage. And that's in general not true. Medicare will pay for brief stays in a nursing home. So if your loved one's in a hospital and they discharge to the nursing home for rehab, that time can be paid typically about 20 days fully paid, and then another 80 days on a copay with Medicare insurance. But Medicare does not cover if someone needs to be in long-term care over the long haul, months and years. And there's not a rehab component. Again, really 100 days is what you're going to get the max out of Medicare coverage. If it's a Medicare Advantage plan, chances are you're going to get fewer days than traditional Medicare. And, there's a lot of misconceptions of what happens that can lead to asset depletion unnecessarily quickly. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But many times families think that because they haven't done any planning in advance, that planning in the crisis is just not available to them. So they rely on the nursing home to do the application for their Medicaid or to advise them on Medicaid. And look, I don't want to sound like I'm bullying or bad-mouthing nursing homes here. They provide wonderful care to our relatives, and they work in an industry that is incredibly difficult. And I appreciate them for what they do. But filing Medicaid applications is not their primary job. Their primary job is care. Our primary job is to make sure that people have advocates during the process. So not only for the legal and financial matters, but also for the care matters. And I'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end in terms of how we advocate. But right now, what I want to get into is, I think it's always important just to talk about levels of care. So in Kentucky, Medicaid, generally speaking, only covers nursing home level of care. And so that's, what you typically think about when you picture the word nursing home in your head. It's that level of care. Medicaid does not cover assisted living. There is some memory care where there's coverage, but the lower levels of care that you see on the screen here are just not picked up by Medicaid. You can see some of the average costs at the bottom of the screen. And as you can tell, the more care we need, the more expensive it gets. And that nursing home level of care, 10,000 or more, like I said before, we're seeing on average around 11,000 in Northern Kentucky right now, is unaffordable for almost everyone. When it comes to paying for care, there are many different ways people will pay. And what I've tried to do with this screen here is talk about the different types of care and the different ways you can pay. So for the most part, you can always use your income, your assets, and your savings. Long-term care insurance really just depends on the policy. If your loved one's lucky enough to have one, it may cover some in-home care. It may cover something with independent living. May cover assisted living, may cover memory care, may cover skilled nursing, fully or partially. Oftentimes these policies have limits on the types of care that the levels that they'll provide, as well as dollar amounts at each level. And oftentimes they have lifetime limits on the policies as well. So the policy will pay out up to $200,000, up to $400,000, whatever it is. And once it's paid that much, there's no more benefit from the policy. It's very important if your loved one, you or your loved one does have a long-term care insurance policy. It's really important to understand that policy and its coverage that it provides. There's also something called a veteran's pension benefit that can help in many of these situations. Often people hear it called VA aid and attendance. And then lastly, you'll see at the very bottom, that's kind of covered by my picture a little bit in the slide, but Medicaid, which again, sometimes can get into memory care, but certainly can cover long-term care in a nursing home. Before I jump into the protection of assets and that, I want to cover some of the sort of essential things that we want to make sure that you have in place as soon as possible. Hopefully you already have these in place, but if you're experiencing some kind of care crisis, it's really important to try to get these documents in place as quickly as possible, if it is possible. So I like to say to help people remember, we all need a superhero. And why do we need a superhero? Well, because superheroes have powers, okay? So I want you to remember that we all need a superhero in our lives. And what I mean by this in terms of powers is, first is a power of attorney. So typically I like to refer to these separately for a power of attorney. Then there's also the healthcare documents. Power of attorney is really focused on legal and financial matters. And a well-written power of attorney can help us avoid the court process that is guardianship and conservatorship in Kentucky. So a well-written power of attorney will help us with things like selling real estate, doing banking transactions, working with insurance companies, gifting, which sometimes is a strategy we use in Medicaid, creating or starting new trusts, and even getting government benefits or working with government agencies. If a power of attorney is not in place and these kind of things need to be done, oftentimes families have to then go through the court process that is guardianship and conservatorship. Guardianship is for personal decisions, conservatorship is for financial. And again, that is a court process that can be pretty daunting. And it does require a finding that someone is incompetent. So if your loved one is going through this kind of crisis and they don't have a power of attorney or healthcare power of attorney in place, and they have gotten to a point where cognitively they can't make decisions for themselves, you may have to go the guardianship route. Medical planning documents allow an individual to have a say in their medical treatment when their capacity diminishes. Once again, if your loved one is in this kind of crisis and they don't have these planning documents in place already, and they've already lost their cognitive ability to understand the documents, that's the guardianship and conservatorship process. But if they still have the ability to understand, what they're signing, having a healthcare power of attorney in place, living will directive, those are both important to name someone to make healthcare decisions for you. Most is something that is filled out with a physician's medical orders for scope of treatment. So that's not something you do through an attorney. That's something that a person does through their physician. The EMS DNR form is what you think of if a person says they want to be a do not resuscitate. The EMS DNR form is what you need to make that happen if an ambulance shows up. So the ambulance isn't going to listen to the person who's named in the power of attorney or the living will. They have to have this EMS DNR form if a person says, I don't want to be resuscitated. And then the last thing on this list is a document called 5 Wishes, which can be a legally binding document. It's also just really a good document for getting into the detail of what a person wants in terms of their care. And it really is very broad in what it covers, from things like, if I was unconscious, would I want music in the background? Would I want someone holding my hand? Would I not want someone holding my hand? I think it can be a great document for discussion with families. Not a fun discussion by any means, but to really get to know what your loved one's wishes are. It's something that's hard to talk about. And also, oftentimes we don't really know where to start. And I think that document really can help with that. Okay, so let's launch into the Medicaid portion of this talk, which is what you were here for in the first place. So when we have a loved one who is needing care, what can we do, especially if we need that care right away? If we're talking about planning in advance, we're going to do a separate webinar on that coming up soon, where we talk about what can you do when we're, planning in advance. And typically what that means from a Medicaid standpoint is 5 or more years from when we think care will be needed. So that's not what we're talking about tonight. Tonight, we're talking about what do we do if we think care is needed very, very soon, or if our loved one is already in a care situation and paying privately. So for that, I want to talk about Medicaid. And Medicaid has 3 main components. There is what I call the health aspect, there's an income aspect, and there's an asset aspect of Medicaid. And I will point out that what I'm talking to you about tonight is Medicaid in Kentucky. Medicaid is a federal program that is administered by the states. So all states have slightly different rules when it comes to Medicaid. So what I'm going over tonight is Kentucky's version of Medicaid. For the first component, health component, all this really means is that to qualify for Medicaid, you have to need the level of care that is covered by Medicaid. So you would need to have, or your loved one would need to qualify at that nursing home level of care. And that's, things like the person needs assistance with activities of daily living, like feeding themselves or bathing themselves or transitioning from the bed to walking or walking to the chair, getting to the bathroom, those kind of things. When a person needs help with those activities of daily living, they're generally going to qualify for the level of care. On the income side of Medicaid, this varies depending on whether we're talking about a single person, single or widowed, or a married couple. But the overall rule is that Medicaid will, they look at it's called the name on the check rule. And it's a little bit antiquated because no one gets paper checks anymore, or hardly anyone gets paper checks anymore. But basically, if you need care, all of your income besides a whopping $60 a month is going to go to pay the nursing home. That $60 a month is called the personal needs allowance. It was $40 until July of last year in Kentucky. So that insignificant number got raised a bit. I like to say you can get half your haircut this month, half of it cut next month on that personal needs allowance. But that's how the income side works. With a married couple, the spouse who needs care, again, their income goes to pay the nursing home. They get to keep $60 a month. The spouse who does not need care, they get to keep their income separately. All of their income. Doesn't really matter what their income is. There are some circumstances too where the healthy spouse at home, their income is so low that Medicaid allows some of the spouse who's going in to the facility, some of their income can actually go to the spouse who's staying at home. There are some theoretical limits when it comes to income. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that. I'll just say that if as long as you make less than what the nursing home costs every month, you can qualify on the basis of income. Assets, we have 2 types of assets for Medicaid purposes. We have exempt assets and we have countable assets. And I believe my next slide, I have a detailed slide on income. I think I talked about all this. So again, all income for the person in care goes to pay for the care, except for $60 a month, essentially. And the spouse, if they do have a spouse, gets to keep their own income. Yeah, we talked about all this. IRA distributions are considered income. So if you have a 401k, 457, Roth, any of those things, those distributions that you take from the account, those count towards income for Medicaid. In terms of the assets, I like to say that we all have this armored truck. And Medicaid does not have the key to our armored truck. And we want to try to put into this armored truck everything we can possibly put in there. But there are by default some things that are in that truck, and those are the exempt assets. Now, I will tell you that truck is a bit leaky, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through. So let me start I'm going to start from the bottom up on these. Life insurance. Medicaid doesn't care about term life insurance policies. Those are the policies where we pay a certain amount of money for life insurance coverage for 20 years. And once that's done, the policy's gone and the coverage is gone. What they do care about are things like whole life policies that have a cash value to them. And in that regard, if the policy has a cash value of more than $1,500, the policy becomes a countable asset, or anything over the $1,500 becomes countable. $1,500 could be protected for a burial reserve is what Medicaid looks at that as. Don't worry too much about insurance policies. There are ways we can deal with those. It really just depends on what the policy is worth, the cash value versus the death benefit. There's some calculations we help people through on that to decide what to do with it. It's kind of to some extent, the least of the concerns. IRA. So these are actually, I use the term IRA because people are more familiar with that, but qualified retirement plans. So 401ks, 457s, Roths, any kind of qualified retirement plan. In Kentucky, we're really fortunate that the principal balance of that plan is exempt from Medicaid. So if you have $300,000 in an IRA, you can still qualify for Medicaid. You don't have to spend that down. All that Medicaid can get its hands on is that distribution that you're taking from it. If it's a sort of standard plan, you have required minimum distributions. Even if it's a Roth, you still have to take something in order for Medicaid to not count the whole principal balance as countable. So that's what I mean by our armored truck being a little bit leaky when it comes to the IRAs. When it comes to a car, for a single person, you can protect one car. For a married couple, you can protect up to two. For the person who's in care, if we're protecting a car for them, the risk we have is that Medicaid could choose not to pay for transportation, so to doctor's appointments and things like that, because the way that we exempt that car is we say it's going to be used to get that person to and from appointments. I joke around, you could go buy a Bentley and still qualify for Medicaid. It's not a good strategy, but a car is exempt. So the asterisk is that, if we exempt that car, it has to be able to be used to get you to and from doctor's appointments. So if you are, bedridden and that car is not an ambulance, exempting the car is going to be difficult. In most cases, typically speaking, cars are not the biggest concerns. House, which is the last thing we'll talk about here in the exempt category. Houses are what is on the minds of most people when they are thinking about needing to go to a nursing home and Medicaid. And the practicality of the house being exempt really depends on whether we're talking about a single or widowed person or a married person. So the easy scenario is a married person. If one person in a married couple needs to go into the nursing home, we can protect the house for the spouse who's living at home. It's protected as long as that spouse who's living at home survives the person who's living in the nursing facility. That house is protected and Medicaid does not try to recover against it. In that same scenario, if we have a married couple and the spouse who's living at home passes away first, now we could have an issue, which leads into, well, what does the house protection mean for someone who's single or widowed? And the reality is that even though the house is exempt, if you are a single or widowed person and you're only keeping $60 a month of your income, what we haven't talked about yet is that for Medicaid purposes, if you're single or widowed, you're only allowed to keep $2,000 in assets that are countable assets. So if you're single or widowed and you're only allowed to keep $2,000 in the bank and you only get to keep $60 a month, you can't afford to keep the lights on. You can't afford to keep the heat on to keep the pipes from freezing. You can't afford to pay the property taxes. You can't afford to pay the insurance. So from a practical standpoint, the house being exempt doesn't do much good. Families often say, well, we'll just pay that because that house is our inheritance. That sounds good, except that Medicaid can recover against that house when the person who owns it passes away if they were receiving Medicaid. So if you own this $200,000 house and you've received $200,000 worth of care that Medicaid paid for, and you pass away still owning that house, Medicaid could recover against the whole value of the house. So that's why the house gets the asterisk there. And now I want to dive right into some scenarios. And before I do that, I probably should have had one more slide in here. I talked about it a little bit on the last slide. In terms of countable assets, for a single or widowed person, I already said this, the max countable assets that person can have to qualify for Medicaid are $2,000. $2,000. Okay, that's it. That's all a person can have to their name to qualify for Medicaid. For a married couple, it's a little bit more complicated. In Kentucky, we're what's called a 50% state, which means that when we add up our countable assets, the spouse who stays at home, Medicaid calls that the community spouse. For the spouse who stays at home, they can keep 50% of the countable assets, but there is a floor and a ceiling to that number. So there's a floor of just around $30,000. It's $31,584 in Kentucky this year, meaning that if you only had $30,000, you got to keep the married couple, you'd get to keep 100% of that. If you have 45, you get to keep 31,500, not 50%. And then the ceiling is $157,920 this year to be exact. So almost $158,000, meaning that, if you have around $300,000 in countable assets, the spouse staying at home could keep about, 150,000 of that. If you have 400,000 in countable assets, you can still only keep about 150,000 of that. So that is the cutoff. That's why there's a floor and a ceiling, and it's a 50% rule. So let's go through a couple of different scenarios. And what I've done here is listed out some assets on the left side of the columns, talked about what I call sort of natural qualification in the middle, and then planned qualification on the right. Okay, so in this scenario, we're talking about Ellen. She's single. She has a house worth $250,000. She has an IRA that is worth $300,000 and about $50,000 in savings. And I'm going to go through a couple scenarios for single people and a couple scenarios for married couples. So in this scenario, if Ellen goes into the nursing home and the family says, okay, nursing home, we need her to come in here. What do we do? Generally speaking, that advice is going to look something like, Ellen's going to need to sell her house, and you can use that money to pay us, and then you can use that $50,000 to pay us. Hopefully, they won't ask for the IRA to be used, but they could, because remember, IRAs are exempt from Medicaid. But if they did, in a worst case scenario, Ellen would be left with $2,000 at some point, and then she could apply for Medicaid, and she would have lost the value of her home, potentially the value of her IRA, and essentially all of her savings. What we would do is the first thing we would do with her home is we would check to make sure there are no exemptions. So in addition to houses being exempt on their own, Medicaid has some specific policies that allow a house to be transferred to certain people without causing any kind of penalties. So caregiver child is one. So a child who has provided care for the senior for at least 2 years and was living in the home with that senior. If we can prove that, we need a doctor's note and potentially a neighbor to write a note as well. If we can prove that that's the case, then we are allowed to transfer that home to the caregiver child. So that's one exemption. There is another exemption for disabled children. So if any of the person who's going into care, if any of their children are disabled, Medicaid has an exemption where we could transfer the house to them. So those are the first couple of things we're going to look at. If we don't have those exemptions, in this case, likely we're going to suggest selling the home. And now we would have $250,000 in cash to deal with. Again, we're going to advise people don't touch that IRA. It's protected. You got to take those minimum draws out. But other than that, we don't want to touch that $300,000. So if we had the home at $250,000 plus we had $50,000 in savings, we could generally protect about half of that $300,000 in assets. And then again, all of the IRA. So at the end, the person who goes through the planning process, even in a crisis, could still protect about $450,000 in net worth at the end. Whereas if they don't go through the planning process, they could be left with, even in a good scenario where they don't spend the IRA, okay, they'd have $302,000. In a bad scenario where they're advised to spend the IRA on care, they would be left with $2,000. So it's a pretty stark difference between, engaging someone like me, our firm that knows what they're doing in this scenario versus just, paying until there's no money left. And I'm when I go over these things, I'm giving this information at a very high level because, I can get into the weeds, but when I start to get into the weeds, it gets really confusing. The point of this webinar is to make you aware that even in the crisis, there are things that can be done to protect assets. So that's why I'm really high level. When we work with families, we actually sit down for what we call a planning meeting. And in that planning meeting, we talk about how their individual financial situation um, fits into Medicaid's plan and what we can do and how we would go about protecting the assets. Okay, so let's cover another example of a single person. In this case, we're going to call this one Mary. She has her house that's $250,000 in value. She has an IRA that's about $100,000, and she has $300,000 in savings. So once again, if Mary's going about this sort of the quote unquote natural way, we might be able to protect the house during her lifetime, but Medicaid could recover after her death, or she's going to be told to sell the house and spend that money on her care. Her IRA hopefully will be protected. Hopefully she's going to be given the advice to not spend that on her care because it is protected, but she might be told that she needs to spend that down too. And then her $300,000 in savings, same thing. So she'd be told she's got to spend that down until it's $2,000. And so in the end, she could be left with, in a worst case scenario, $2,000, and that's it. If she's given good advice on the IRA, she might have $102,000 at the very end. If we talk about then planning with someone like us, an elder law attorney that knows how to deal with Medicaid and knows the loopholes and the ways to protect assets. Again, with the house, we're going to do the same thing I mentioned before. We're going to check for any exemptions. And if not, we probably going to sell the home and try to protect half the value. Once again, with the IRA, we're not going to touch it, just those required distributions. And then with the savings, first thing we're going to do, there are some things that we can spend money on that makes sense. Buying a prepaid funeral, buying any new clothes or furnishings that Mary might need for her room. And otherwise, we're going to take that $300,000 cash, combine it with the money that we have from the house, and we should be able to protect about half of that. Usually we can protect about half, even for a single or widowed person. And so in the end, working with an experienced elder law attorney like us, Mary could have protected about $375,000 in that process. Whereas going the other way, she may have been only protecting, $2,000 to maybe $102,000. So pretty stark differences in those two scenarios. Let's go over a married couple. So we have here Mike and Marty. I just used, for the most part, some of the same numbers, carried them over. So in this case, again, $250,000 house. For the house in this scenario, remember, we're going to be able to protect the house for the spouse who stays at home. What could be dangerous is if the spouse who stays at home happens to pass away first and there's not a plan to deal with the home. Because if there's not a plan, then the house could end up, right back in that single or widowed scenario we talked about before. I've covered the IRAs enough at this point. I don't need to really jump back into that. And then in this case, I'm saying there's, $75,000 in savings and investments. Remember, I mentioned Kentucky's a 50% state. So basically what what the scenario would be like in that situation is they'd be told, you got to spend until you're about, $37,500, and then you would be able to qualify for Medicaid. So in the best case scenarios, maybe they've protected the house, the IRAs, and about half of their savings with, going with the nursing home or sort of doing it on their own. The things that we would do in terms of the house, whenever we have this kind of situation, we always try to deed the home to the healthy spouse. And we want that healthy spouse's will to have some protections for the spouse who's in the nursing home. So that way the house, if the healthy spouse passes away first, the house just doesn't go directly to the person in the nursing home. There's some protections we can put in place there. IRAs, again, we've talked about those enough. And here's a really stark difference in these two scenarios. With married couples, we can generally protect all of the countable money. It depends on how it's held. And there's, I'm always cautious to say, in general, this is what we can do. It's not always the same, but in general, we would be able to protect all $75,000 through some different tools and get the person qualified for Medicaid right away. And so, even in this situation, you can see there's some good savings by working with an attorney who knows what they're doing with Medicaid. So let's talk about one more married couple scenario. And in this case, this couple has a little bit more, a little bit less in IRAs, a little bit more in savings. And you can see at the bottom the difference there. So it's even potentially more stark of a difference when we're talking about a person who has more money that's countable versus the IRA that's exempt for Medicaid. So again, in this scenario, even with $300,000 in savings, we could potentially protect all of that and still get the person qualified for Medicaid pretty quickly. So these are things a lot of people don't know. They just assume that they have to spend all their money or spend half their money to get qualified, and it's just not the case. So the takeaways that I want you to have from this presentation are that even in a crisis, we almost always have ways to protect assets. And yes, that even includes when a person is already in a facility in private paying. We work with clients like that all the time who have they've been private paying, and they're like, wait a second. And they hear from a friend or they see a webinar like this and they go, oh my gosh, we can actually protect some of mom and dad's hard-earned money. For a single or widowed person, generally speaking, rule of thumb is we can protect around half. And then for married couples, a lot of times we can protect all of the countable resources. Medicaid does conduct a 5-year look back for any transfers. So anything that we do, we have to keep that in mind. And sometimes if you do transfer something for less than fair market value during the 5 years before you need Medicaid coverage, that is going to create a penalty. There are sometimes we create a penalty intentionally as part of these strategies. Unfortunately, there's a lot of times where families create penalties unintentionally, and that can be a problem to deal with. They've given away gifts in the past, sold a house for less than it was worth, things like that. Those can be challenging to deal with. And the most important thing really is to consult with someone early, because oftentimes earlier, there are many more options than to deal with it than later when resources have been depleted. And that really gets to this whole concept of there's no better day than today. And what I mean by that is just that if your loved one is in this situation, waiting typically just means more money being spent. So dealing with these things sooner than later is important. I'm going to skip that one. So this is my contact information. Unfortunate that, let's see if I can find well, there we go. You can visit our website, which is www.stages.law. And there's a way on the website to book an initial call. So the way that we work with people is we always do like a 15-minute call just to make sure we're a good fit. Occasionally we get people calling us for divorces and things like that. We don't do that. So we do a little 15-minute phone call just to make sure we're a good fit to work with each other. From there, we send you a questionnaire just to get some more information about you or your loved one. And then we have that planning meeting where we really sit down and dive into the details of your situation and how we think we can help. Everything that we do is flat fee based, and it's always discussed in advance. We also do something somewhat unique. There's only one other firm in the area that has a care coordinator on the team. So we have a care coordinator, and her job is advocacy. So we don't just do a Medicaid application and a Medicaid strategy and leave you to go. Our care coordinator actually helps with making sure she can do a lot of different things. She's amazing. Johnny will, if your loved one is in the hospital and needs to go into a nursing facility, she can help narrow down the search and find the one that's the best fit. When your loved one's in the facility, she attends the care conferences. So if you feel like things are not going the way you want them to go, if the care is not up to the quality that you believe your loved one deserves, Johnny can go to those meetings with you. She can address it with the staff there. And also set expectations on both sides about, is what you're seeing normal or not normal. And she really just provides ongoing advocacy for our clients. And it really is, when people work with us in life care planning, which is what we call that, they are always universally at the end of their representation, or even during the representation, talking about how thankful they are for what we're doing for them. So we do that actually usually over the course of a year, and it's renewable at the end of a year. So that's how we work with people. Again, like I mentioned, if your loved one is in this situation, the best thing to do is to reach out sooner than later. We're happy to have a conversation with you and, discuss whether there's something that we can do to help. I don't know if the chat is working. If there are any questions, you're welcome to send them through in the chat. Otherwise, we can always, again, have that conversation. So you can call the phone number 859-559-0518, and our answering service will get you scheduled on our calendar. Or you can visit www.stages.law. It's actually stages.law/booking. We'll also get you to the form, or you can go to stages.law, and there's a link to book an appointment with us. I appreciate your time and watching this webinar. I hope you found it helpful. We'll send out some surveys afterward as well. And I don't see any questions in the chat right now. So I will end with thank you for your time and have a great night.